And hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. This is the Ukrainian conflict, a historical and contemporary analysis. My name is Robert. This program is being recorded. It'll be on our YouTube channel. I'll email out the link if you have to drop off early or if you want to listen to it again. So we'll email out the link for it. It won't be posted, though, probably until Monday because we have a full schedule of events between now and Sunday evening. So look for that on Monday. And this program is being presented by, this is a joint effort of different groups and individuals working together to put this together on such short notice, and special thanks to all of our panelists that are going to be joining us. But this is a joint program hosted by History, mostly ancient discussions, Washington, D.C. history and culture, Baltimore history and culture, New York history and culture, and London history and culture, and a few other miscellaneous groups. So thanks so much for joining us. My name is Robert Kellerman. I'll be one of your co-hosts. I'm going to be joined by several other individuals, in particular my good friends Richard and Zach, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Just a little bit about me. I'm a big history buff, and I'm currently joining you from Austin, Texas. I split my time between Austin, Texas, and Washington, D.C. And with that, Zach, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Zakar, or Zach, as everybody calls me. So I am a co-host with Richard and several others of a group called History Mostly Ancient. And we basically started an in-person events. And then after the COVID happened, we started doing Zoom events, and we mostly talk about ancient stuff, but we do modern stuff and medieval stuff. For example, Richard has his program he does on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Now he's starting on Thursdays. He's talking about medieval Middle East, particularly like this Thursday, you're going to be talking about Napoleon, and so please join if you want to listen to that one. We do have also a presentation on Qing Dynasty, which is the first emperor and the warring states. We're going to talk about China, and then Sergio has granted us an opportunity to also do an in-person events. We're going to go to Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and to actually visit the medieval arms and armor, and Sergio is reenactor of Roman and medieval armor group, and he will talk about that, and after that we can grab coffee and whatnot. So our group has YouTube channel, we have our meetup channel, we actually have a website. It's called omnicarta.org. Those do join us, and without further ado, I'll let Richard and then Robert, if you don't mind, I have other two panelists that also would like to introduce themselves because they're going to be.
Of course. Yep. Richard, take it away.
Hi. So for those of you who know me, I am generally seen as a lay expert in Middle Eastern affairs and history. And I'm a lawyer, so I'm probably the best polished in our group of History Most Ancient, which is why I'm going to be emceeing tonight. I'll give a little bit of sort of background on Ukrainian history, and then I'm going to pose some questions to our panelists to really work out what are the military situations, the humanitarian situations, the global implications, and go through some more details than what you might see on a 5-minute news clip. There's definitely going to be a discussion of the rules, how much time this is going to take, all those different attributes. So that way you know what's going on. I see that some people are raising their hands. I can't help you if you raise your hand. If you have a comment, please put it in the chat. That's the easiest for me to monitor and to respond to. I do respond to the chat. Yeah, so I think the next person we'd like to talk is Greg. Greg has lived in the United States since the 1970s, but he was born in Russia and can provide a unique perspective. Greg?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, I actually came to the United States in '79, but I'm following. I listen to Russian and Ukrainian radios and commentators. So right now Russia is expanding. They're moving forward, but very slowly, unexpectedly. I often think that as I was growing up, they were saying that Germany, Hitler's Germany, attacked Soviet Union without declaration of the war, and he started with bombing Kiev. exactly on June 22nd, 1941. And I'm thinking that this is exactly the same thing how this war started, because there was no declaration of war. As a matter of fact, it is not allowed in Russia right now to call this conflict a war. It's just a special operation. So all the opposition radio, there is a couple of opposition radio that is being closed right now. They were forced to call it special operation. They can't even use the word war. So it's kind of ironic of what's happening right now. It's definitely a horrible conflict. And I think from what I know, in Russia, there is a lot of people on the street. Not enough, of course. It is extremely dangerous. It's not like, opposing the government here in the United States. There you get serious consequences, but still there are a number of people out there and they're being arrested. We're talking about thousands of people being arrested. So all, I would say, intelligentsia in Russia mostly opposing this war because they understand what's happening. Maybe they have a connection to the Western sources as well, because Russia is completely closed everything, and there is only Russian propaganda is being used right now for the local population. But it's a dire circumstances. Putin is resolved to win this war. I think he's going to encircle Kiev and try to bomb it to submission. He's doing.
Hey, Greg, why don't let's get into let's have Aaron introduce himself, and then we'll get into the presentation that I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on that. So hold that thought for just a minute, and we'll let Aaron introduce himself, and then we'll let Richard take over the presentation, if you don't
Sure,
mind.
of course.
Thank you.
Oh, great. Hi. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi, I'm Aaron de los Reyes. I can't start my video. I don't know if you know that or not, so I live in northern New Jersey. I'm from Southern California. I spent a dozen years in the U.S. Army and active duty in the reserves. And I work in technology. I've done a lot of presentations with Richard. I have sort of a combination of a lay background and let's say, above amateur background in international relations and sort of military affairs. And I'm going to try to, provide color where appropriate to what we're seeing, at least in terms of what's going on in Ukraine from a Russian and Ukrainian combat perspective. But it's one thing we have to realize, it's a very low information environment right now. So, our lens and the, let's say the degree of what we see is very limited right now. So that's some of what we'll discuss based on available information.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Aaron. So Richard, why don't you take over the presentation, the helm, and it's all yours. And really encourage everyone to chime in with their thoughts and opinions and questions in the Zoom chat and the Q&A. Your items won't be seen by other participants, though, unless they're approved by the host. We do that to deter Zoom bombers, which frequently try and come and disrupt our programs. And with that, Richard, take it away. It's all yours. Richard, while you're pulling that up, there were a couple questions. How long will the program run today? I'm here as long as we're having a interesting discussion, but what was the schedule wise at your end, were you thinking?
I'm just going to take a hunch at about a couple hours.
Okay. Again, if someone needs to or wants to drop off, they can't stay for the whole entire, this is such a complex and important topic. We didn't want to rush it. So we are going to go for a while. If you have to drop off or need to drop off, that's no problem. We won't be offended. And remember, the program is being recorded, so you can always listen to the parts that you missed later on YouTube, and we'll email out the link on Monday.
We can't hear you, Richard. So if you're
Yeah, he
talking-
was muted. I just unmuted him. I'm not sure
Okay.
what's going
Okay. Okay.
There we go.
Sorry about that. So can you hear me now?
Yo. Oh yeah, we
Good.
can hear you now, loud and clear. see
Verizon
you.
commercial. So this is not an academic presentation. I myself, Greg, Aaron, Zach, we're all not academics, and we're going to give this as a discussion on the issue. So there's going to be a really great opportunity, especially after we do a lot of the history, to really dig into some of the questions. Of course, we're going to ask that everybody be respectful. And what that means is just taking the situation seriously. Whether you have a pro-Russian opinion, a pro-Ukrainian opinion, that's absolutely fine. We're not here to change your mind on how these things are, only to explain and deepen the situation as it is. And I love interactivity. For those of you who've seen my presentation before, I do read the chat. Please put your comments in the chat. Do not ask in the Q&A, because it becomes very difficult for me to clear it. But if you ask your comments in the chat, I will read them. I will talk about them, and I will bring them up, especially when we get to the latter part and we have our discussion with our panelists.
And Richard, let me just interject. So we don't expect when the program is over with, everyone will have the exact same thoughts and opinions on this topic, because even your hosts that are here today, when we had our
We don't share the same opinion.
ago, we were even disagreeing on some of these topics. So I guess my thought is we're going to present information as factual as possible, and then kind of let you draw your own conclusions from there.
Also, do not raise your hands. I can't do anything about that. If you have a comment that you want to add, please put the comment in. Now, the presentation will be about 30 to 40 minutes. Some of the other commentators might add a bit of color here or there on some of the points, but we're going to try and move through the presentation part relatively quickly. In terms of what happens afterwards, I budgeted approximately 2 hours. So that gets us to about 7 p.m. New York time. That's sort of when we'll sort of cut it off. But I'm sure that, as we've said before, you want to come in, go out, leave, do whatever you want. You want to buy groceries with this in the background. Everything is fine. There's more than enough people to make this meeting worthwhile. If a few people decide to leave. Now, again, as Rob pointed out, this is going to be recorded. You can watch it later. All the rest of it. All right. So I've got a few questions before I start. The first is, it's sort of a response to Greg's question of, and it's basically, are there any outlets for Russian people to learn the truth? Russian internet isn't highly censored. In the same way that, for example, the Chinese have the Great Firewall. So Russians who are able to understand English, for example, or able to understand Ukrainian or other languages, can often go on YouTube and find other things, or they use a VPN and they go to other sites. But the problem is that a lot of Russians only have access to the state media, in much the same way of, how many of you, get your internet news via the internet, and how many of you get your news because you watch NBC or CBS or MSNBC or CNN or whoever who's on the main televisions. It's a very similar sort of situation. So a lot of Russians only get information from the mainstream media in Russia because that's how they've traditionally gotten their information. I have some comments about how also how in World War II the first invasion was of Minsk, not of Kiev. That's correct. But in the same way, it was sort of a parallel to the undeclared war. All right. And
Richard, you want me to start with this?
yeah, no. I know, I've got it. I was just trying to figure out what the other questions were. Okay, so now, in the beginning, we have the Slavs, and the Slavs sort of divide into three different groups, right? You have the Western Slavs, the Southern Slavs, and the Eastern Slavs. And the Western Slavs are Poles, Czechs, Slovaks. You can sort of see on the map on the right-hand side that these groups sort of go together. The southern Slavs are those of Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bulgaria, Macedonia, all of these areas. And you can see that there are areas the Slavs don't occupy, like Albania, because the Illyrians resist them, or Greece for the same reason. Now, we can ignore the Western and the Southern Slavs for the most part in this story, because both the Russians and the Ukrainians are from the Eastern Slavic group, and they tend to be throughout the territories of what is now the former Soviet Union, right? Now, the first...
Richard, can I add something just very quickly?
Mhm.
So just to go through a timeline pretty quickly. So we have a first trace of the Eastern Slavs is 500 AD. So they kind of start moving eastward toward Volga River, which is where can you bring up the previous slide quickly?
Sure.
It's very quick. And mostly they lived in this huts called izbas. And the way izbas worked is it was a one-room log cabin with gable rood and wooden window frames, right? And mostly villages worshipped many gods, particularly the two gods are very important. Volos, which is the cattle and sheep, and Perun, god of thunder and lightning. So kind of like in developing. And so the first interaction that they had is with Byzantium, obviously, was around, a little bit later. And where do we get all these chronicles? There's this monk, his name is Nestor, and Nestor lived around 1100s AD. And basically his chronicles, they used to be called the Tale of Bygone Days, where he describes how the Russia came to be. So basically, I just want to go very shortly into it. So what happened is, a bunch of Slavs lived around the Kiev area. And according to Nestor, the Slavs were so discombobulated that they wanted to invite somebody that's called Varangians, which is it's basically a tribe of the Vikings, right? Or they come from the noble.
Exactly. And you can see the Vikings on the right hand side here on the map. So they meet with this group of Slavs, and you have a number of different competing tribes, as Zach pointed out. And because these tribes are all competing, they agree that the Varangians should rule over them, right? Because that way, none of the singular tribes has this leadership, and that leadership based in the Varangians becomes what's called the Kievan Rus, and Rus because they consider themselves Rus as their ethnicity, and Kiev as in where they're based. And the Kievan Rus doesn't just control Kiev; they expand through their trade routes up through the rivers, up through a lot of the lowland plains, which characterize this part of Western Russia today. And you can see in the lower right-hand side and in the lower left-hand side, two different understandings of the extent of their empire. But either way you slice it, it is a massive amount of territory that was under their control, small amount of population, because a lot of these are nomadic or quasi-nomadic or sedentary, but tribes, not empires. So you have some sort of civilization that begins to develop there.
Yep. Just a couple more things that in that period that you've pointed out. So the famous people that were invited, particularly, they were called as North Varangian chieftain, and their names were Ruriks, right? And particularly the two brothers were the Sinisius and Truver, right? Rolling forward through time, you probably, if you've seen the series of Vikings. There was this Viking, his name is Varangian Igor the Ingvar, or Ingvar. Igor is a Russian name, Ingvar is the Varangian name. And he was around 912, 945. And basically, he's known because he have attacked Constantinople numerous times, ended up basically settling, have a settlement agreement where at the time, the monetary measure they use is grivnas, which is the Ukrainian current monetary exchange or monetary measure, and that was from a Kievan Rus. And apparently the 13 grivnas were paid for each ship to be, it was like a dowry that, or the kind of like push away money that was paid by Constantinople to, because Ingvar was pretty known. And the last thing I'm going to mention, the colonization of Russia happened It was actually a queen that was canonized and became Orthodox. Her name is Olga of Kiev, who was related to Ingvar, was his daughter. And basically that happened around 945 AD. So go ahead, Richard, sorry.
Okay. So this Kievan Rus situation was actually largely, for want of a better term, democratic. It's a very strong term to use, but in a lot of cases, because of the very sort of low-level organization of these areas, you had nobles and common people were arguing about policy in sort of the town square. So it's democratic with that, you know, that small d. It's not organized democracy, and that gets completely sidetracked by the Mongol invasion. So the Mongols basically terrorize the country. They install a number of these rulers called bashkak, which begin to divide the territory into feudal territories and murder a number of the Russian leaders. You can see in the lower right-hand side, Michael of Chernigov, who was one of the princes who was required to submit to the Mongols. He refused to submit, and so he was killed and replaced by another more pliant member. And as it took Russia centuries, 2 or 3 centuries, to remove the Mongol presence, they became sort of animated by a desire to expand their power, to prevent anything from the east from destroying their country to such an extent. And they also unified and organized their authority in complete contrast to the system under the Kievan Rus, which was this more dissipated kind of authority. One of the main issues is that Russia now had all this territory to expand from. Now, somebody's asking where the Mongols came from. The Mongols came from Mongolia. They came all the way across the steppe, and that was part of the expansion of Genghis Khan and his successors. I have a question of what is the relationship of Olga to Saint Prince Vladimir of Kiev? Greg responded that I think she was his mother. So now, as Russia becomes more centralized and imperial in response to the Kievan Rus, it begins an expansionist phase, and Russia never actually ends its expansionist phase until the 20th century. And even then, it's debatable whether that phase has truly ended or not. And you can see on this map all of the territories that Russia began to expand to start after they had repelled the Mongols from their territory. So that doesn't mean that all of the Eastern Slavs, though, were under the control of the Russians during this earlier part of the expansionist period until about the mid-1600s. And one of the groups that was part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was a Catholic-run state, but incorporated many people from many different religious backgrounds, including Jews, pagans, Muslims, and Orthodox Christians, was the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which was somehow less democratic than the Kievan Rus style system, but certainly more democratic, let's say, than the Russian organized Tsardom, which was an absolute monarchy at this point. And at the edge of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and at the edge of the Russian expanse was what was called the Zaporozhian host, which was a group of Cossacks being sort of Russian settlers, you can think of them in that sort of sense. But Russian, I mean, in the big sense, in the Kievan Rus sense of settlers. And some of them were what we can call today Ukrainian. Some of them are what we can call today Russian. Some of them are what we can call Belarusians. These terms are anachronistic to apply to this time period, but they are Eastern Slavs who would eventually become all parts of these different nationalities. And the Zaporozhian host in particular becomes sort of the nucleus for a new type of identity. And this identity forms mostly in rejection of Polish control, because the Polish had demanded a number of taxes from them and they simply didn't want to pay. So that leads to the creation of a Cossack government, or Hetmanate. Hetmanate meaning that a hetman was a leading commander in the Cossack militia, if you want to call it that. And the hetmanate would be based at what was called the Zaporozhian Sich, which is a sort of wooden fortress that's built in the middle of the Dnieper River. For those who are familiar, the Dnieper River is the river that cuts through Kiev and runs through the center of what's today Ukraine. The Zaporozhian Sich engaged with a number of different rivals. Sometimes it even had its own civil wars, where part of the Zaporozhian Sich would side with Russia, part would side with Poland, part might side with the Ottoman Empire. All of these parties were involved in this period, and this really was part of the galvanizing force for the Ukrainian national message. I have a question of, does hetman translate to headman? It does not. It's a term for commander. I wanted to ask our panelists if they wanted to sort of comment on this formation of Ukrainian identity during this period.
Yeah, if I may, I think it's probably started in 17th century, specifically of the uprising of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, who was the hetman at the time in the mid 17th century. And he basically tried different ways, but eventually he got into the war with Poland for independence. And he realized there is no way he is gonna make it. So he asked for the help of the Russian Tsar. At that time, it was Alexius, which is the second of Romanov Tsar, Alexius Mikhailovich. And Romanov, obviously, it's a Romanov dynasty, just the second one of them. And he basically provided protection. They fought together. And as a result, in 1654, there was agreement signed called in the city of Pereyaslav. It's called Pereyaslav Rada. And that agreement de facto made the Bogdan Khmelnytsky and all the Zaporozhian Sich part of Russia under Russian first protectorate, and eventually it became just part of Russia. And that's really how it's all united. That's the unification of Russia and Ukraine. And probably you could bring the Ukrainian identity probably started from there. Like that's where people started to become aware that there is such a group of people that call themselves Ukrainians. And Ukrainian in Russian language means the kind of the end, kind of on a borderline, something like this. So that's
right.
That's it for now.
Yeah, no, and that's exactly where the term "the Ukraine" comes from originally, right? It's this territory on the edge. The difference between using the Ukraine and Ukraine without the is usually understood as a recognition of Ukraine's national status as a country, as opposed to just a region or a territory. There's a comment that it's a little bit confusing. If the earlier feudal period is made of disparate groups, why is it considered Russia? One of the things that I skipped over, because of course this history is incredibly long and complicated, but the relevant parts are what I was delineating. The first part of what is today Russia that forced the Mongols out was the Duchy of Muscovy. And so Moscow became the center of a new state of Eastern Slavs. And this state of Eastern Slavs, as it expanded and conquered other of the states and pushed the Mongols further and further east, this group of Muscovy declared themselves to be the Rus, to be Russia, the place where Rus were living. And that's where the term Russia comes from today, this expansion of the Duchy of Muscovy.
Could I add something a little bit
Sure.
here? The foundation of Moscow is basically established at 1147. The first kind of what we know, the dynasty of Rurik dynasty, comes from the famous Prince of Novgorod, Alexander Nevsky. His son, Daniil I, in 1262, became the Prince of Moscow, which was like only starting as a new princedom, and eventually developed in the 14th century. It was favorable. It's got what they call Yarlik. This is the grant of rule from Mongols. And from 14th century, it started to develop as a dominant power, but definitely the beginning of it probably related more to the Ivan III, what they call Ivan the Great, to the 15th century, end of 15th century. That's probably the foundation of the dominance and expansion started at large.
And then it was Ivan IV who took the name Tsar, right?
Right. Ivan IV, who was a grandson of Ivan III, took the name of the Tsar in 1547. So he is the first Tsar. He is still one of the last of the Rurik dynasty. And we know him as an Ivan the Terrible.
All right. So as Russia's moving into the height of its expansionist phase, we sort of get into Russia advancing at a rate that Ukraine cannot match, and Ukraine has become part of Russia because of the agreements in the 16th, 17th, sorry, in the 17th century. And that's during the reign of Tsar Peter I. So he really expands his power and solidifies control over Ukraine. In particular, he does this because he wants to access a warm water port, right? And this is in the Battle of Azov, which he fights against the Ottoman Empire and its vassal state, the Crimean Khanate, which is why, for example, there are the Crimean Tatars who live in Crimea. That's a Muslim population. He conquered this territory along the border of the Sea of Azov, which is still in Russian territory today. And he founds the first Russian warm water port of Taganrog. This precedes the building of St. Petersburg by a few years, for those of you who are more familiar with that warm water port. But the control of the Black Sea became an incredibly important strategic need for Russia if it was going to develop a navy, if it was going to compete with European powers, if it was going to be part of the global economy. Russia, under Peter the Great, before this, was a landlocked country with the exception of Arctic Ocean ports, which are frozen for most of the year. So they needed access to the rest of Europe beyond just rivers. And when the Russians conquered this part of what is today Ukraine from the Ottomans and from their vassals, like the Nogai Horde, like the Crimean Khanate, they began to settle it with a number of their own people. And you can see even today that the populations in these regions reflect this Russian settlement. Ethnic Russians make up over 30% in most areas along the border with the Black Sea and that connect to Russia. You can also see, if you compare it to the map on the right-hand side, the area with 32% is the easternmost portion of Zaporozhia, which is that area in the sort of orange borders, right? That's the borders of the Zaporozhian siege. And you can see that the majority of Ukraine in the northwest area that was not taken by Russia is still majority Ukrainian. So Ukraine becomes annexed by the Russians more or less throughout the reigns of subsequent emperors and tsars, especially Tsarina Catherine the Great. And Ukraine becomes, like all the other Russian territories that she annexed, part of the Greater Tsardom. You have Russians moving into Ukraine, especially because Ukraine is an area that can grow a lot of wheat. It becomes a breadbasket that sustains a large part of Russia. But in World War I, the Russians pull out of World War I because of the Communist Revolution. And Lenin and his emissaries sign what is called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ceded a significant amount of former Russian territory. Ceded a bunch of territory to what was then the Second Reich, the government of Germany at that time. And one of those territories that was ceded to Germany was a significant part of Ukraine, and so Ukraine begins its own state, its own independent state, and they incorporate a new emblem. You may be familiar with this emblem because this has been reappropriated by the modern Republic of Ukraine. But at this point, we're talking about the Ukrainian People's Republic, which existed roughly around the end of World War I until the Soviet Revolution could concretize its control of Moscow, St. Petersburg, and the major cities of Russia in 1921, and then take over areas outside of that. And that was a symbol calling back to the Cossack Hetmanate, right? That a government of Zaporozhye, and was sort of a symbol of the last time Ukrainians or people who could see themselves as Ukrainians had a government of their own. Do any of the panelists want to add something to this sort of first moment of Ukrainian nationhood?
Let me see.
No,
What do you consider first moment?
No,
really?
that this was a self-declared independent state with its own government that was at least nominally Ukrainian.
Right. But you're talking about yeah, that period. It's a very short period. So of course, that's the first time Ukraine became independent. So you could actually go from there, and I'm sure that it was process. Building the identity is the process. It takes centuries. I mean, I think the Ukrainian identity really solidified in the past, 30 years, and especially in the past 8 years, which is like, there is no doubt that it is now in existence.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely going to cover that period, but yeah, so I wanted to sort of point out that this was the first moment since the Hetmanate that the Ukrainians had independence, even though it was short-lived. Now, we then have this tension that the Ukrainians have between different parts of their country being occupied by different powers at different times. So I want to draw a little bit of attention to the Polish-Ukrainian War, which occurred after World War I, but before World War II, where Josip Pilsudski, I have a quick question of how big is today's Russian landmass compared to the continental US? Russia is significantly bigger. It might be as much as 2 times the size. Somebody could just check the numbers on me.
Probably 2.5 size
yeah.
of the US.
Yeah. So Russia is more massive. US has more population at this point than Russia does, but Russia is more massive. Okay, so Josip Pilsudski was this general / president of Poland. He occupied several different positions. Sometimes he was the Secretary of War, but effectively he was the ruler of Poland. And while he did that, he wanted to create a bulwark between Russia and Germany, so that way Poland wouldn't be erased from the map again. Remember, Poland didn't exist after 1795. The Russians, Prussians, and Austrians carved it up. And in the treaty that ended World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, Poland was given independence again. So, Pilsudski wanted to create a multi-ethnic Polish state, very similar to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that had existed before. And he saw Ukrainians as part and parcel. Part and parcel of the development of Poland. So that's exactly what he did. And so he declared war on Ukraine before it became part of the Soviet Union, and annexed, you can see that dark red area on the lower left-hand side of Ukraine into Poland. So now you had Ukraine effectively divided between the now Soviet Union and the government of Poland prior to World War II. So we're getting into the 1930s, and in the 1930s, we have a very dire situation in the Soviet Union. Stalin requires certain amounts of grain production, and those grains are sent from Ukraine, because Ukraine is, of course, the breadbasket, as we mentioned before, and those grains are sent from Ukraine to what's now Russia, right? The areas around Moscow and St. Petersburg. So the amount of grain collected was not redistributed to the people who grew it. And so you had what was called the Holodomor, or the Great Famine. This, from the Ukrainian perspective, and from the perspective of most genocide and democide scholars, was an intentional famine, meaning that the food existed to feed the people who were in that area, but the food was not allowed to be consumed by them. The food was forcibly removed from their person. And you can see, for example, these are the streets of Kharkiv in the upper right-hand side, and you can see people literally dying of starvation on the sidewalk.
Can I add something here?
Sure.
The reason why this all happened is because Stalin, at some point at the end of 1929, stopped the new economic policy that Lenin introduced and started the process called collectivization. That's where he started to create collective farms, and that was grossly ineffective. And the reason why this hunger was all over started is because of that, because the whole agriculture was disrupted by this kind of structural changes. And whether it's intentional or not, it's contested. Certainly, there are two sides to the story. So hard to say. Probably was. I don't know. It is contested. I don't want to take sides here. But the result is that it was almost like the millions of people died, and the Russians, the Russian population was they were populating. They were the Russian ethnic groups started to move into these Ukrainian areas, and they populated the eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, I would make the one caveat, this might be a point where we disagree, is that even though the collectivization led to a number of food shortages, relatively speaking, compared to pre-collectivization production, along with the dekulakization policies, I believe that there was actually enough grain in Ukraine to feed the Ukrainians. The problem is that the Ukrainians weren't allowed to access it because the Soviet authorities prevented them effectively from getting the grain. They used military force to prevent Ukrainians from accessing the grain. But if you look on the map on the left-hand side, you can see the areas where the highest numbers of Ukrainians died. If you look in the areas that are the most black, you can see the city of Kiev. For those of you who can't read Russian, sorry, this is Ukrainian. For those of you who can't read Ukrainian, Kiev is the one that starts with a K. You can also see the city of Poltava, Cherkasy. Cherkasy. These are all major Ukrainian cities today. And so this was deeply destructive to the Ukrainian population and helped to create a sense of Ukrainian difference from Russia, especially when you take into account the Ukrainian perspective that this was a genocide done to Ukrainians, which, as Greg points out, is not the Russian perspective on this event. So, because of the relationship that the Soviet Union had had during the Holodomor against the Ukrainians, because of this view, the Ukrainians were in a very strange position when World War II happened, which is that they were naturally inclined to be aligned with the Nazis to a certain degree because the Nazis were coming to remove the Soviet government that they felt had abused them. And so you had some leaders from the Ukrainian side, especially Stepan Bandera, who allied with the Nazis against the Soviets in an attempt to create an independent or quasi-independent Ukraine under Axis control. And so you have a number of these heroes like Bandera, like Stretsko, who were pro-Nazi sympathizers. In certain cases like Bandera, they were also very much anti-Semitic. And there is a certain degree, especially in the westernmost parts of Ukraine, which had been under Polish control, those parts that did not suffer the Holodomor and were generally wanting to save their fellow Ukrainians who were under Soviet control, there's much more favor towards these sort of heroes, rebranding them today as Ukrainian nationalists. Of course, this is negatively viewed by a significant percentage of Ukrainians as well, and is negatively viewed by people elsewhere in the world because of the affiliation with the Nazis. Do any of our panelists want to sort of talk about a little bit about the Stepan Bandera and some of the other Ukrainians during World War II and how
Yeah.
I'm going to get to the Red Army side on the next slide, but if anybody wants to comment on the pro-Nazi side of the Ukrainian defense.
Right. Yes, Stepan Bandera is become a symbolic of Nazism and connected to the Ukrainian independence and identity in Russian circles. He basically was collaborator with Hitler, but once he came to some recognition by German government, he actually wanted to create an independent Ukraine and was prosecuted by Nazis. But he is definitely known as someone who is like Nazi collaborator. And right now, the word Bandera or people who follow him, there are people of right wing who follow him. They're equated to Nazis, and that's what Putin is referring to all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to add some.
Sorry,
so
I just want to quickly respond. I'll let you talk, Zach. There's a question about how early in the Nazi period did the pro-Nazi Ukrainians ally with them. That would have been in 1941 when the Soviet Union was invaded, and there's a question about whether Nazi brutality ended up negating sympathies. Most Ukrainians who are sympathetic with this, and there is a significant minority who are not sympathetic to the Nazi Germans. They're sympathetic to these Ukrainian leaders who happen to be aligned with the Nazi Germans. So there's not really a lot of positivity in Ukraine today for the Nazis writ large. Zach?
Yes. So just wanted to kind of go through a chronicle. Initially, the propaganda minister of Germany was particularly very interested in this character, Bandera, and his co-associate Shushevich, who basically were wined and dined by Hitler and the minister of propaganda, and were basically brought to Berlin to show, like, look, this is what's going on. There's also another general, Russian general, who defected, the communist Russian general who defected to Germans. His name is Vlasov, and they both were used for propaganda purposes as well. But never at any point that Germans had used them in combat, both Ukrainians or Russians that defected. The only time they used them in combat is during the Warsaw Uprising, where the Poles tried to uprise against the Germans. It was 1944, and they used the Ukrainian and Russian collaborators against the Poles. But in fact, he's considered to be independent because he did want to see Ukraine independent. He was lied to by Hitler, but he was anti-Semitic, and he was also anti-Polish as well. That's what I just wanted to say.
That's absolutely right. All right. We also have to notice the contrary, which is that 4.5 million Ukrainians became part of the Red Army during World War II. That supremely dwarfs by about an order of magnitude the amount of Ukrainians involved in Stepan Bandera and Strelsko and Shushevich, all of those Nazi collaborators sides. And there are one of the things about the Red Army is that it was not ethnically divided for the most part. There are certain segments that were, like the first Ukrainian front, the second, third, and fourth Ukrainian fronts. Now, those groups were delineated as Ukrainians, but most Ukrainians were part of Red Army divisions that were ethnically mixed. And so it's sort of hard to find any symbol of those units acting. But based on records, over 900,000 Ukrainians won Soviet medals as soldiers in war for what they've done. You also have Ukrainians that fought on the Allied side outside of the Russian army. You can see, for example, this is General Władysław Anders of the Polish army, and he was running the Free Polish Army, meaning after Poland surrendered in September of 1939, after the Blitzkrieg. A number of leaders of Poland moved to the United Kingdom and continued the war from there. There were Ukrainians in the Polish army, there were Ukrainians in the American army, in the Canadian army, in the British army. I think if you can name an army on the Allied side, even the Free French, had Ukrainians in their ranks. The Ukrainians participated on the Allied front and multiple sides. They were also involved in the partisan movement. You can see in the lower right-hand side, a village priest is receiving a medal for being a partisan in what's called the Patriotic War. That's the way, the Grand Patriotic War is the way the Russians refer to World War II. And he was receiving it for his service in fighting sort of a guerrilla campaign. That's what the partisans were doing. They were plainclothes fighters in a guerrilla style war, fighting against the Nazi Germans. And he's getting rewarded for it. We also have Ukrainians commemorating sites of massacre. So for example, on the left-hand side, lower left-hand side, you see Babyn Yar. Babyn Yar was the single deadliest day for Jews in the entirety of the Holocaust. Over 33,000 over 33,000 Jews were shot to death there in one day. During the Soviet period, it was recognized as a site where Soviet citizens had died, but it wasn't made exclusively about Jewish suffering until Ukraine became independent. And you can see that then they began to commemorate it as a site of Jewish massacre and death. You can see Volodymyr Zelensky in sort of a small picture providing an offering at the memorial to those dead Jews. Most Ukrainian presidents have done similar in sort of in attempts to create rapprochement with the Jewish community. I have a question that whether the Ukrainians were involved in the final solution. They were not involved in the final solution. People like Stepan Bandera were certainly opposed to Jews living in Ukraine. They were less concerned about Jews worldwide than I think the Nazis were. Does anybody want to give a comment on the Soviet side of World War II from our panel?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment that final solution, that's probably referred to Jews, but we have to understand that according to Hitler's race theory, the Slavs, which Ukrainians were also part of, were also subject to extermination, just not,
Not immediate.
After the Jews. I mean, so this is this is, and the Soviet side is basically, I have to say that even though there were some Ukrainians fought on the Nazi side, there were some collaborators. The majority of Ukrainians fought on the Soviet side against Germans, were part of the Soviet army, and actually had an extensive and very effective partisan campaign, or what they call guerrilla war. That's in the beginning was not even directed from Russia. It was like national movement against Germans, and eventually later on, as Russians started to advance, they took control of it. So that's we have to really look at this way. It's not like Ukrainians are pro-Nazi. The majority of them are against Nazi. It's only the extreme part. And I just want to say that in Russia right now, a lot of people being brainwashed that the Ukrainians are being controlled by Nazi elements, Banderovцы, what they call them. But this is not true. As a matter of fact, in the ruling party, before Maidan, it was 10% of them in their ruling. But I'm talking about the what they call Rada, or what they call like a Senate. Now it's only 2 or 3%, so it's an insignificant amount, but it's being misrepresented.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to something in the comments before I move forward. In Russia, there were a number of, in the Soviet Union, people were designated by nationality. That was something that was written in your passport. That was something that was an identity marker. And so Jew was an identity, was one of these nationalities, along with Ukrainian, along with Russian, along with Tatar, along with Chechen. There were over 100 different nationalities within the Soviet Union. And so Jews were not Ukrainians until Ukraine became a modern country post-Soviet fall, and then people received Ukrainian citizenship. And then these national distinctions that had existed within the Soviet Union became a sort of different discussion. Now, once World War II had ended, Ukraine was subject to the same kind of Soviet repression that had existed elsewhere. You had deportations to the gulags, you had a security state, you had large-scale industrialization, which led to general degrees of unhappiness and life alteration. And that sort of followed through the entirety of the latter Soviet period. One thing that's worth mentioning that changed during the post-World War II Soviet period is that Crimea was attached to Ukraine in 1954 by Khrushchev because Crimea is a peninsula that juts out of Ukraine. So from a logistical standpoint and from a water standpoint, we'll discuss that a little bit later, it makes sense to add add Crimea to Ukraine. And of course, as this was all within the Soviet sphere, it made perfect sense to just change the organization. Another point that we should make is if we look at the territorial evolution of Ukraine, you can see on the western side those areas in yellow, pink, and brown. Those are areas that were not formally part of the Soviet Union before World War II. They became part of the Soviet Union after World War II and were adjoined to Ukraine. Now, the majority of the populations in those regions, with the possible exception of the brown regions, were Ukrainian ethnically, but because they had not been in the Soviet Union, right, they had been part of Poland, they had been part of Czechoslovakia, they'd been part of other states. They had a very different experience prior to World War II, and that follows through with those areas being a little bit more nationalistic than the areas in the rest of formerly Soviet Ukraine.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that this is kind of a major split in mentalities, because those territories that were acquired by Soviet Union as a part of agreement with Hitler, and then eventually after the war, they did not spend all this period from between the revolution and World War II. They didn't spend it within Soviet Union, so they had formed somewhat separate mentality, and they probably much more for Ukrainian independence than the rest of the country. But right now, it's right now everybody in Ukraine, probably majority of population in Ukraine, I can't say everyone, probably for Ukrainian independence from Russia.
So when Ukraine became independent, we had a number of, so the Soviet Union broke up, and it's a very complex process about how that happened, but the simplistic answer is that there was a committee meeting between the heads of the various constituent republics, and from that meeting, the constituent republics decided that they would remove the ruler of the Supreme Soviet, the one who would unite all of the 15 constituent republics, and therefore all the leaders of the constituent republics would effectively become their own national governments. And that's what happened. So Ukraine came under the rule of the former Soviet governor of Ukraine, of the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. And now we had a very strange situation, which is that you had what were ostensibly Russian nuclear missiles, because Russia became the nominal successor state of the Soviet Union. And these missiles were located on numerous different kinds of bases. You have a map of the major ones throughout Ukraine. And so there was a discussion between the Ukrainians and the Russians as to what should be done about these missiles. Now, in 1994, towards the end of the year, this picture is from the earlier part of the negotiations as opposed to the later part. In 1994, in the later part of the year, they wrote the Budapest Memorandum. And the Budapest Memorandum basically said that Ukraine would give up all these nuclear missiles, and in exchange, the United States and the NATO members would defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine, right? Because of course, Ukraine giving up these nuclear missiles was a huge change in their ability to act defensively. And in many cases, you're going to see references today in the news to the Budapest Memorandum, the understanding by Ukraine that it would be defended by the United States and NATO allies. Now, even though Ukraine was independent as a nominal characteristic, it was not independent from a functional political perspective. The rulers of Ukraine had heavy influence from the Kremlin, from Moscow, in controlling their elections. And so you can see, for example, this is the election between Yanukovych, who was effectively a Russian puppet, and Yushchenko from 2004. And if you look back to that map that divided the territories of Ukraine between the Zaporozhian host and those areas that would come to be occupied by the Russians on one side, and those areas that were part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth on the other, you can see that the borders almost exactly match the election results, and that the Western Ukrainians wanted Yushchenko, who was more Western aligned. The Eastern Ukrainians wanted the one that was more Russian aligned. And you can also, I didn't have it, but if you can overlay an ethnic map with this political map, you'll see that the ethnic divide is roughly the same. That ethnic Ukrainians generally voted overwhelmingly for Yushchenko, and ethnic Russians within the borders of Ukraine voted majoritarily for Yanukovych. Now, this situation, Yanukovych, quote, won the election in 2010. There were, and because the Russians basically forced the victory. And so in 2014, as he was running for a second term, there was a massive revolution in Ukraine to try and oust him and to make Ukraine more independent. This was called the Euromaidan Revolution, or the Orange Revolution. And so when Putin talks about pre-revolution Ukraine, he's referring to the Ukraine that existed under Yanukovych, when it was still aligned with Moscow's interests. This Euromaidan Revolution, which is still, of course, in living memory, it happened in 2014, was Ukrainians besieging the government in Kiev. You can see this is Maidan Square in the center of Kiev, and forcing Yanukovych out of the country and allowing for the first free elections in Ukraine, truly free elections in Ukraine's history, which resulted in the election of Poroshenko, who ruled until 2019. Of course, in 2019, he ran for re-election against Volodymyr Zelensky, and Zelensky defeated him in a landslide. Poroshenko was seen as an ineffective leader, despite being recognized as a Ukrainian leader for Ukraine. Now, there are some strategic elements that I want to discuss before I get to our panelists. One of the things is that from the Russian perspective, we often see them talk about the defensive position relative to Europe. And one of the things to point out is that, as we mentioned, the Mongols were able to go across Central Asia. And the reason they were able to do this is that there are large, flat areas in Central Asia that allow you to run roughshod over all of Russia. And you can see, if you look at the topographic map on the right-hand side, that most of Russia is relatively flat. There was a question about the ethnic and ethno-religious composition. It's more complicated than that. But if you look at this map from a defensive position, what Russia has tried to do historically is push the border as close as it can to what is Germany, so that way it can narrow that gap, narrow the amount of flat land that it has to defend. And that was why at the height of the Cold War, it turned Poland and East Germany into satellite states, because the East German border is far easier to maintain than a border stretching 2,000 kilometers around the edge of Ukraine. Now, you also see that as NATO expanded, and there were some promises given auditorily, nothing was signed by the United States that NATO would not expand. But because NATO has expanded all the way to the edges of the former Soviet Union, including the Baltic states, Ukraine is in a unique position where they have one of the longest borders with Moscow, and they haven't declared their alignment with NATO or outside of NATO, and they're direct, and unlike Finland and Sweden, they are directly in that path of possible invasion. So the Russian Federation was organized the CSTO, which was a counter organization to NATO. Kazakhstan is a member, Armenia is a member, Belarus is a member, along with Russia. And Ukraine has historically been neutral with regards to NATO involvement and with CSTO involvement. And another thing that I wanted to point out is that one of Russia's main sources of revenue is through energy markets to Europe. You can see all the oil pipelines that run from the fields in Eastern Karelia, which is that part of Russia that's very close to Finland, and the Yamal field further east. During the Soviet period, many of these lines only went through Ukraine, but Ukraine began to charge a tariff when it became independent for all the oil that passed through it. So Russia began to build oil pipelines that would circumvent Ukraine and maintain its status. You can see how much money that Russia derives from oil exports. In terms of tax revenues, oil and other energy sectors are responsible for about 50% of the tax revenues collected. So this is so Russia can properly be understood in terms of economics as a petrostate with some degree of industry. Now,
Richard, I would jump in and say I would add petrostate and a natural resources state.
Yeah.
Because if you look at all of the mining products that can be generated, but it's raw materials. They don't do the intermediate processing. That's that's a gap. So
yeah. There's a question that the Russian Federation was also a guarantor of Ukrainian integrity under the Budapest Memorandum, and that's absolutely true. But it was more understood by the Ukrainians that both parties would be, both the West and the East would guarantee its territorial integrity, but the West would be more likely to have to intervene because it's very unlikely that the West would try to annex Ukraine and that Russia would have to intervene. Okay.
There's a question on the Savaki corridor. I don't know if we want to take that or we want to just
if you want to go to it, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a corridor. It's roughly 65 kilometers wide. It's a strip of territory linking Poland and Lithuania, and it's basically it always has been NATO's most vulnerable choke point along the whole eastern flank. So if you think of the eastern flank, the risk always was that if the Russian military operating Army Group Corps from Kaliningrad and Belarus could attempt to close the corridor, you would incapacitate basically NATO providing any security to the three Baltic members. And then obviously during the Cold War, it forced a huge amount of defensive forces from what was the West German army and obviously U.S. Army. For the most part, there was some French and Poles, and I mean some French and UK members also that would rotate in and out of there. But that was always a sort of a fundamental critical
defensive issue. Yeah,
exactly.
So now the thing is that Ukraine also has natural resources of its own. It has known oil and gas deposits in both its easternmost region, very close to Kharkiv, and its western region. It also has oil deposits in the Black Sea. Most of these have not been properly extracted at this point. There was investment that was starting in 2012 that became halted in 2014. It's sort of gotten back to fits and starts, but this could provide an alternative for Europeans who don't want to buy Russian gas and oil, which is currently floating their economy. Now, we had mentioned the water problem in Crimea. Crimea is effectively a salt flat. So it doesn't actually have a lot of water on its own. And so during the Ukrainian period, which is why, again, Khrushchev assigned Crimea to Ukraine, the Ukrainians built what was called the North Crimean Canal. You can see it on the right-hand side in its current dried out state. And the Ukrainians blockaded when the Russians took Crimea in 2014, they blockaded the canal so that the water that would normally flow through it from the Dnieper River couldn't reach Crimea. And at the point of the Russian invasion, there were record low amounts of water in Crimea. It was actually being rationed by the Russian government there, and the reservoir was at 7% capacity. Now, in the invasion of Kherson, which occurred 2 or 3 days ago, the Russians actually blew up the dam that the Ukrainians had built, and so water is beginning to reach Crimea again. And this is sort of a map of prior to the invasion. You can see that there were Russian troops placed in Crimea and in the Donbass. That's because the 2014 and 2019 Russian invasions of those regions, or Russian support of separatists in those regions, depending on your perspective. And the Russian government began to mobilize about 200,000 soldiers around Ukraine, some of them in sovereign Russian territory, some of them in sovereign Belarusian territory. And the Belarusian leader, Alexander Lukashenko, is on very good terms with Putin, which is why he permitted that to occur. And of course, you have Volodymyr Zelensky from his famous address to the Russian people, telling them that he doesn't want war one day before hostilities began. And people wanted to sort of understand a little bit about Volodymyr Zelensky's career. So he was a comedian actor. He's also a Jew. And so far, that's seen as completely natural and normal. I haven't seen any propaganda against him. In fact, some of the Ukrainian nationalist groups that even tend to be more pro-Nazi haven't really said anything against Zelensky as a person for being a Jew. Which should show you how integrated they are to this extent in modern Ukrainian society. In his TV show called Servant to the People, he was a commoner who accidentally gets elected to the office of president and begins to deal with corruption. And in reality, in 2019, with 74% of the vote, he was accidentally elected as president and began to try and deal with corruption. So life imitating art in a very serious way. Of course, you can also see him giving his famous quote, "The fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride," to the US president, because he had been offered an airlift out of Kiev when the siege began on February the 24th. And one thing that I also wanted to mention before we turn it over to the panelists for a really sort of in-depth discussion going over some of the questions is that we also see Nazism and expansionism within the Russian frame of reference in terms of their external policies. And so you have Alexander Dugin, who is the foreign minister of Russia. He flits into different kinds of roles, but he's primarily Putin's ideologue when it comes to foreign development. And he has tried to incorporate fascism into Russian approaches. You can see there his what he called fascist Bolshevism, because of course Bolshevism refers to the communist leadership style that was prevalent during the Soviet period, and he's trying to align it with fascist principles. So you can see the double eagle style of the Nazis integrated with the hammer and sickle. And so it's not just the Nazis who are a little bit fascistic. We can see that, the Ukrainians who have some members who could be perceived as fascistic, we have that on the Russian side too. And Dugin had created a policy of weakening countries that wouldn't agree to be Russian allies in the post-Cold War climate by supporting breakaway regions in those countries. And you can see a map of those breakaway regions in the eastern, on the left-hand side. You can see, for example, in Ukraine, you have Donetsk and Luhansk. Those regions, of course, are Ukrainian breakaway regions from that are now pro-Russia. In Moldova, you have Transnistria, which is a breakaway region that is pro-Russia. In Georgia, the same sort of thing. You have two breakaway regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, that the Russians had propped up, especially with war in 2008. You have the Nagorno-Karabakh Republic, or the Artsakh Republic, as they call themselves, which is an ethnic Armenian breakaway republic in Azerbaijan, because Ukraine, Georgia, and Azerbaijan and Moldova have taken a more pro-European stance than Russia would otherwise like. We also see Russian military intervention in CSTO countries that could run the risk of going more pro-Western. For example, there was a small riot in Kazakhstan earlier this year in 2022, and Russia got all the CSTO members, including Armenia, to deploy forces in Kazakhstan. You can see these are Russian troops maintaining a checkpoint in Almaty, the economic capital of Kazakhstan. The functional capital, the political capital is Astana, but Almaty is really the center of Kazakh life and economics. So Russia is trying to maintain control over the parts of the former Soviet Union that it can through an expansionist military policy. And this is a map of the war. I'm sure as our commentators will begin to comment, this will become a useful map in order to demonstrate where the different cities are, where the Russian advances are, and what's been going on. This is an updated map from today. And so I have some pertinent questions I'm going to ask our commentators. I'm also going to ask the questions that we see in the comments. And so this begins sort of the more open part of the conversation. So I'm actually going to go with the questions in the comments first, and I'm going to leave open the answers to our commentators. So let's see.
Yeah, the tactical objectives of Russians, I see. I mean, it is pretty obvious from the beginning that at the least what the Russians wanted to do is to connect Crimea to the rebelling regions of Lugansk and Donetsk. First of all, to supply Crimea with water and all other stuffs, and basically annex that territory. But we can't really know exactly what Putin has in mind. He is openly saying the words denazification from the word Nazi, which because he insists that it's a Nazi regime that is now ruling Ukrainians. I think it's a serious disconnection with reality, in my opinion. But that's what he's saying, and he also wants to say he wants to destroy Ukrainian army, so that Ukraine would not be able to respond militarily at all. So at this point, where he goes all the way, he probably wants to. I think he probably wants to temporarily go through all Ukraine and destroy whatever the organized armed resistance exists there, and then maybe pull over, because he won't be able to probably hold it, pull over to the eastern part. But he definitely needs to take Kiev and install a puppet ruler there, and hopefully, from his point of view, killing Zelensky would probably weaken the opposition. I mean the fighting spirit. So that's how I see it.
So I wanted to add to it. He uses two slogans: denazification, demilitarization.
Yeah.
Of Ukraine. And what's the most sickening thing is he recently had employed Ramzan Kadyrov, who is his puppet in Chechnya. And he's currently is making plans to invade mostly Russian-speaking city of Kharkiv. There's mostly Russians that live in that city. I mean, demographics, it's unbelievable. And let me tell you, not to say anything ethnically or anything, but he's particularly, and I, absolutely respect Chechen people, but he's been ruling the Chechen state with his iron hand. And whatever he's going to do to the Kharkiv is going to be a travesty. He's going to destroy that town. They're already bombing. They recently had bombed a 9-story building completely. Was about 50 people that died. They had they said they opened the corridor for humanitarians to escape. Nobody's escaping because people are afraid. So it's travesty what's happening. So I'm going to let others talk. Sorry.
Yeah, Aaron, do you have any comments on this?
Yeah, so what I'd like to do is sort of maybe lead off with what we can see, at least at this point in the low information environment we have, of what the Russian assumptions were going in. I would call this the Plan A. So the Plan A was basically a shock and awe campaign sort of a quick and dirty, partition of Ukraine and decapitate the government. It was, in sort of foreign policy terms, basically, these were all maximalist sort of objectives and goals. And it's treated, and it still does, Kyiv as the center of gravity. Not Zelensky and his leadership, which I would argue is a mismatch that the Ukrainians have at this point, and that they're taking advantage of. It was driven by war optimism, meaning, we can go in, we can showcase it. It basically didn't learn anything from 2014, at least at this point. It was driven sort of in a brazen, high risk taking approach, but at the same time, and this is what's sort of fascinating about it, is that it was held to a fairly high level of operational security. I don't think you can claim any campaign, maybe in history, of this size that has had this much operational security, to a point, and this is sort of in the world of secrets, that you can be too secretive. Because if your people don't even know that they're actually not doing an exercise, that they're invading another country, or that they were in a low information environment, thinking that there was already maybe an agreement. So when the Russian soldiers and forces went over the border and began their and launched from their line of departure, they thought they were going to be, basically greeted as somebody who was freeing them. And so that I view that as sort of plan A, and they're still in plan A. And in the real world, not the video game world, when your plan A doesn't go the way you like it, it doesn't take hours and days to fix it. It takes typically weeks and months. And I would argue they're in the middle of fixing it, and I would call it Plan B. I don't know if you want me to go into that, Richard, or you want me to?
No.
talk about
I
something
have
else?
some questions from the comments.
Okay.
Some
Sure.
of them I think we can handle pretty quickly. Will the current situation potentially lead to World War III? I think that is a possibility. I don't think that it's probable, because I don't see large-scale engagement from NATO that would lead to that World War III. I don't see Western boots on the ground in Ukraine, but I'll leave it to our panelists to.
Yeah, so I have a quick point there on escalation. So when we say World War III, we kind of take a jump up a curve, and actually in the technical world of international relations, it's called the escalatory ladder. It's like a 44-step ladder by this famous guy Kahn, who wrote a great book and all kinds of great papers on it in the 60s and 70s. So when we say World War III, we're assuming the top of that ladder. I don't think we're anywhere near that, but at the same time, I will say that in the last 7 days, the level of economic sanctions arguably is an economic embargo. And when you can sort of, and I don't mean this in sort of a normative way, but in sort of just trying to be objective, if you look at any state in the world that you put this much of an economic embargo on, that is in essence a declaration of economic war. And I don't think we've sort of, I think our desire to support the Ukrainians have sort of jumped that ladder, that escalatory ladder I was talking about, moving up that, without maybe the discourse to recognize that, that's a lot of steps up that ladder that the Russians could start to respond. And I would argue, and I know this would be a very, very small minority opinion, that the Russians are keeping this to a limited war within Ukraine, and that we are in the West expanding across what's called domains, like all the domains. Think of land war as a domain, special operations, cyber, air, these are all considered domains. And we're sort of expanding wide across all the domains within a week. And at this point, the Russians are either keeping their powder dry on escalating, or they're so consumed by moving to Plan B that they'll get back to this. They'll sort of ignore it until it bites. And I would argue the Russians are in this sort of it's a race right now. It's really, I think you're in a race right now. You're in a race of the Russians have to figure out how to reduce their war aims down to something they can achieve without getting to exhaustion, because every force gets to an exhaustion point where you have to, in essence, recycle. And that's probably a month, maybe 2 max. At the same time, they have to pivot economically, basically to the non-aligned world that they have relationships with, and can, in essence, compensate for their hit to GDP, which will probably be 10% this year. And so to me, that's sort of the race they're in. And, you know, everything that everyone's doing is sort of built around that race. So.
All right.
I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah. Now, one of the questions is, do people think that the Ukrainians can win? Is there any positive news that can come out of this? What if the Ukrainians can win? What would be some avenues for that kind of victory?
I mean, look, I think the Ukrainians have they have their own race, basically, and I think their race is pretty straightforward. It's UAVs, drones. So they've been using, they built their own, it's called the Punisher. It's very low cost, you know, about 150, 200,000, 250,000 with the command center and all the munitions. And then the Turkish TB2s, which are a couple million each. They have about 20 or so of those, and they're getting, I think, another 10 or 20. And so, and then all the SA-7s, 14s, basically Stingers, Manpads, to try to have an air denial campaign or an air contesting campaign, at least at the low level. Cyber, counter cyber, all the anti-tank munitions, the anti-tank guided munitions. I think they're absolutely winning the media and information war at this point. So that's not even a question. I mean, people are going to study this for, you know, a long time, at least this part of it. I think the big thing they've done is they've reorganized into these sort of small, sort of platoon, troop size, scout, recon, sniper, sort of semi-special operations teams. And then they're allowing the population and outsiders, like a Ukrainian Foreign Legion, to form like armed resistance territorial guard units. That's going to be interesting because that's a lot of untrained people, which can consume a lot of your more experienced people to try to develop them. So that's going to be a real point of friction at some point. And I think if they can, in essence, rinse and repeat around this, that's sort of their strongest defensive approach. It's not so much to win, but to have the Russians lose, to exhaust. So I think the best strategy, now I would argue, I think they are running the risk of engaging too far ahead with very limited forces. I think and this is a debate, right? There's no right answer. That right answer is going to happen in the field. I think the question is, can they lure the Russians into a maneuver war into more central Ukraine and completely exhaust their supply lines, and then just basically, you know, attack their rear lines with all these quick reaction forces I just talked about. I think that could be the pathway for, in essence, a devastating loss by the Russians if the Russians took the bait. But for the Ukrainians to do this, and this is very hard when you are in an armed sort of guerrilla campaign, you have to sort of turn that part of your brain off to say, defend everything, defend everywhere at all costs, and get a lot more strategic. And the question is, are they going to be able to do that in the next few weeks? If they did that, I think the Russians could actually be in trouble. If they didn't, then they're going to just basically fight a defense in depth. They're just going to get ground back. And I think that's, and the way the Russians are fighting, this is Grozny 1999, 5.0 or 10.0. It's an order of magnitude or 10 orders of magnitude of Grozny, and which was basically large pincer movements. You know they're coming. You just can't do anything to stop it, basically, and they're just going to throw everything at it. And you can't forget. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, there are a few questions. Some of these questions relate to the historical stuff, so I'll just handle them pretty quickly. Did Ukrainians consider Jews Ukrainians or Russians? I sort of touched on how Jews were a separate nationality. I heard that the KGB had extra losses when trying to hold Ukraine. Relatively speaking, that is true. Although Russia had larger KGB losses just in general, and KGB losses in the West. It costs a lot of lives to maintain a surveillance state. There's a question about what is the Pale of Settlement, and that is the area that the Jews were living in, and it corresponds to what's now Poland and Belarus. There are some parts that are in what is now Ukraine, but the Jews that were in Ukraine were primarily there because of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, not because of the Pale of Settlement. There's a question about, does the map also mirror a religious position as well as an ethnic position when you're comparing the Ukrainian versus the Russian map? And that's not exactly the case, because Ukrainians used to be part of the Russian Orthodox Church. And as part of the Russian Orthodox Church, they were unified religiously. In 2019, there was a breakup of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, where the Supreme Patriarch in Constantinople recognized several other breakaway groups in Ukraine as being a Ukrainian national church, which is very common in Orthodox circles for these kinds of churches to be created and formed. But the result of that was that some Ukrainians identify with this new church, some Ukrainians identify with the Russian church, and those delineations are harder to place on a map than what we're talking about. And finally, Aaron mentioned the term de-escalate, and somebody was asking what that means. To de-escalate a situation means to bring it closer and closer to peacetime, because when you enter a war, there are a number of steps that lead to the war actually materializing, the scale of the war actually growing. As he mentioned, and I agree, but it's hard for us to see it, the war is actually in a very small state. It can be escalated far further, right? You can have large-scale bombing raids of Ukraine. You could have attacks that Russia would perpetrate against a NATO member. You could have large-scale blockades, food shortages, right? Within Ukraine, to force the population to surrender, like through these means. So those additional steps would be escalation. Now, I have a question that's probably on a lot of people's minds. Is Putin insane?
Yeah, no. I mean, I think in the modern normal world, we like to believe anyone that launches anything that is military at any scale, that they must have a screw loose. And that makes sense at sort of like a human level, like in our neighborhoods where we live, obviously. But when you're looking at sort of these great powers or state level conflict, to me, attempting to sort of psychologically evaluate a set of sort of intentions around someone's psychosis, I don't think really provides a lot of insight, to be honest, because there's a infrastructure of maybe 1 million Russians, maybe more, probably a few million, and you count their families, maybe 10 million, who benefit from the Russian state. I'm not arguing that's the approach to governance you should have, but that is the way they exist. And so they're all party to this, right? It's not that he has some magic crazy red button that you would get at Staples and he pushes it randomly and crazy stuff happens. This is a contingency-based set of decisions that are driven by their state policy. And this invasion is that. He doesn't have an invasion button and then everyone robotically began an invasion. This is something that has been developed by thousands of Russian.
Could I add something? My assessment.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly, insane is a very generic kind of a word, because how do you define it? There could be all kinds of the people who are paranoid are insane. There are all kinds of problems, psychological problems that people, they're not he's not completely delusional, but he might have some psychological disorders as a result, especially of his isolation because of the COVID and being in power for too long, and narrowing down people who have an access to him. So those people obviously are afraid of him. He actually wanted to bring all the members of his government to be complicit before he started the war, complicit in this decision. And he actually called them out publicly on TV to say that they support this decision to recognize those breakaway states of Lugansk and Donetsk. And it was very obvious watching them on Russian TV that they are really, really afraid, because he was on their case. One of them said, yes, I will support your this decision. And Putin asked, you will support, or you're supporting it? So he's kind of really, it clearly everybody is afraid. At this point, he really likes, in my opinion, he's closing, like being like Stalin. And whether that constitutes insane, and is he insane to start nuclear war? Hard to say, but he cannot lose this. He has no choice. He will throw everything that Russia has onto Ukraine, and whether Ukraine can withstand that or not, that's a big question. I mean, a lot of people.
Well, and I think you're bringing up something, Greg, which is something we can't forget, that as bad as this has gone for the Russians so far, we can't forget that they're an artillery army. I mean, that is their identity fundamentally as a land army. And in the West, we use basically airframes as our artillery. And not that we don't have artillery, of course, but in terms of the scale, volume, and density, it's nowhere near what Russian, Soviet, and then eventually Russian again doctrine is. And so in the end, he is going, or they, and I want to get away from he, because I think we are just so over personalizing this, because there is a they, there's a command they are going to really apply this pincer movement, which will just grow over time. And now the question is, and this is really the issue I was bringing up earlier, which is the Russian assumption is that Kyiv is the center of gravity. And if those of you know or have heard of von Clausewitz, or the sort of concept of where the center of power is within a state, or its political and or economic and or military power. So there's a judgment that that they made, which just like the United States made going into Iraq, that Saddam Hussein in Baghdad was the center of gravity, which obviously was not correct. There's a very similar assumption going on. And this is something great powers do when they tend to invade, is they make a very sort of linear judgment like this. I would argue.
So now that we have this point that Putin's not really that insane, that he's at least thinking somewhat logically, what can he see as sort of the end goal of this? Because at best, he's got something very similar to the Iraq situation, right? Where he's occupying a hostile country. There's going to be some kind of large scale insurgency. He's going to have to dedicate a lot of soldiers to maintaining it. What's sort of the thought process there?
So I think he has a red line, which is the Odessa to Rostov. And we didn't talk about this. I brought it, I put it in the chat. So maybe if you want to give a little color, Richard, on the Crimea, 1783, et cetera, because that is extremely important. I argue that's his Hawaii. And from a Pacific Fleet standpoint.
Just for a moment, if I can clarify what he's talking about, the city of Rostov is here, more or less, on the map, and the city and Crimea is here. So this Rostov to Crimea connection that he's talking about is controlling this piece of land that would make Crimea directly attached to Russia, right? Because here it's connected by a bridge, and would make sure that Russia controls the city of Kherson, meaning that it can make sure that Crimea has access to water. So this entire area would be under Russian control.
And I also go all the way to Odessa because that gives them a defensive line, obviously. Yeah. So that's why I add that. So just so you know. So anyways, if you can, do we want to talk a little bit about why that's important? I mean, it's not just sort of random. It has.
Well, I mean, we talked about the oil situation. We talked about the control of the Black Sea situation. We talked about the Crimea situation with Sevastopol.
Well, yeah, no, okay, so
Sevastopol, but
yeah, so the Black Sea is the warm water port for the Russian Navy, and this is their global navy. So, and this is established going back to 1783, and the three greatest admirals and one of the greatest admirals in history, are basically the people who established that and built this navy is sort of fundamental to the ability of the Russians to project power. And I argue this is a similar red line as the United States had with Hawaii and Pearl Harbor going into the war with the Japanese. And so I think we have to sort of evaluate if the goal is to get to ceasefires, and the Ukrainians are obviously pressing the gas. They have one direction they're going, they're pressing the gas, and they're asking for a faster gas pedal. And that makes sense, right? It's a war of survival, but it's going to be very challenging to try to get to a diplomatic off-ramp if at the end of the day, the Ukrainians are going to demand basically an ejection of Russians from all what used to be Ukrainian territory, let's say pre-2014, because the Russians just won't comply with that, no matter what the costs are. Because it's at the strategic, it's at a strategic intent level. Then it's larger than Ukraine, and so this is gonna be the challenge in the next matter of weeks and months, if there's going to be any diplomatic solutions or off ramps that are going to get constructed, because I think that's war aim number one. I've always viewed that as war aim number one, is secure that, guarantee that's outcome. War aim number two, I would say, is create basically left bank Ukraine as a set of artificial Russian republics. So basically all of the, you have the map there, everything east of the Dnieper River, those would become, and that would, to me, that would be sort of the second aim. And then the third one would be a favorable government in Ukraine. You could do one and not get two. You could do 1 and 2 and not get 3, but you can't do 2 and 3 and not get 1, which is obviously Sevastopol. And I think it's important to think of it that way.
Absolutely. Now, there are sort of two functional questions that people have asked. Does anybody have any particular website or affiliated group that they can post in the comments for everybody to read about places where you can donate to help Ukrainians who are suffering and help them move through the humanitarian disaster? So
I know Ukraine's embassy does on their website, and also the Red Cross has set up, or they're setting up a special mission. And also the EU has a, I forgot what the name of the sort of EU's inner Red Cross is. They have their own
links. Aaron, can you share the links if you can find, please?
Yeah, I'll dig these up.
Yeah. Okay. Now, another question that people have had is whether or not mercenaries, wet work teams, other types of militants that are supported by the West could be brought into Ukraine to tip the balance. Should NATO members sanction Russia's oil sector, all those kinds of things?
Yeah. So I have an answer around the whole escalate. This is back to that escalation discussion, which is, if everyone can follow that a separate type of activity is considered a domain, like cyber is a domain, armored warfare is a domain, special operations intelligence type stuff is a domain. So I think there's this challenge in the West in terms of supporting the Ukrainians, is that how many domains do we want to expand to support the Ukrainians that run the risk of triggering a Russian escalation? Because I would argue the Russians, there's a set of escalations the Russians haven't triggered yet, which I don't really hear discussed. And I think they're pretty important. I don't know if we want to bring any of those up, Richard, or not, but
I mean, I think we mentioned some of them when I talked about expanding them. I think actually that might be, because I have that question here, right? What are the ways the Russians can escalate the conflict? I guess I have that twice because I thought it was so important.
So I would say they have, and I'll quickly go through these. I've categorized sort of eight big ones. They can, in essence, generate the largest migration, humanitarian depopulation event, at least in terms of orchestration, probably said some of your presentations in the 1800s, where you could have tens of millions of Ukrainians flooding into mostly Poland, Germany, France, UK, Italy, the large European states, Hungary, which will have a dramatic effect on their politics, on everything, right? I mean, it will just overwhelm them. That's one. The amplification into what I call the dirty war, right? So Chechnya 5.0. And the Russians are preparing to do this. I mean, that, I argue, is the reversion to the mean in terms of Russian doctrine. So they're going to revert to the mean. They tried it in this sort of postmodern way, is the last week or two, and I think they're now going to revert to the mean, which is go dirty and go hard. I'd say the third one is starting to expand operations from Moldova and Belarus at scale. That would be a substantial escalation. Then the next one is cutting off EU energy. They can't do that until they've secured somebody else that can acquire the roughly the 8 million barrels a day, or 6 to 8 million barrels a day of oil, plus the millions of cubic feet of natural gas, and then they can move and arm short, medium range ICBMs, and and basically begin the scare campaign. They can launch a total cyber infrastructure attack versus the EU, soup to nuts. I mean, we're talking you hit everything at an infrastructure level. And then they can launch, and this would be sort of their response to an economic war, is you basically go after the banking system. Now there's a blowback on that, obviously, everywhere, but that is sort of the burn the house down strategy. And then the last one is they move their nuclear subfleets to encircle Europe, Baltics, North Sea, Atlantic, Mediterranean. So then that forces, by US naval doctrine, US Ohio and Virginia class subs, and now we get sort of hunt for Red October mode, and that is probably the biggest escalation they could do, and this is all done to force the EU to back down, basically, and then ultimately NATO, and then force some type of limited war. So to me, that's their escalatory curve. It hopefully sounds scary because it should be. And I think they've held all this back, and I don't think we sort of have processed that, and we're pressing the gas in the West, and the Ukrainians are pressing two gases, and at some point, they're going to start to shift, and this feeds something we don't know, which is we might think. Oh, go ahead. Sorry to
stop you, but we want to hear. And again, we want to hear Patty's perspective. You just made a.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
And then Patty, go ahead.
You know what? I think what I just said in the comments is being exaggerated, and at the moment I feel uncomfortable because I think that it's being taken the wrong way. I do have perspectives.
What we want to do is you tell us how.
Zach, just no speak.
Okay, I do have perspectives, but there's a certain focus going on right now, and my perspectives tend to be somewhat different and tangential to some of what you're talking about. And since you have a very active conversation going on, I don't think anything I have to say would be helpful. And I didn't mean to make it seem like it was a contentious thing at all. It isn't. I don't feel in any way that I'm being.
Well, actually, I was going to change the topic. So if you want to change the topic first, go ahead.
Not like out of the blue like that. I mean, it has occurred to me, I think I mentioned it before, that naturally we're very focused on the humanitarian aspects of this, and I think that's natural human behavior. And in doing that, I mean, we tend to automatically polarize this. It's either Putin or the Ukrainians, which is understandable. It's a very difficult situation with a lot of potential ramifications for not just those principles, but the world at large. It has occurred to me that Putin really does not care about much else other than to lay claim to the Ukraine, or to Ukraine, and he thinks of it as the Ukraine, I should clarify. I don't think it matters to him how many people he kills, how many people he forces to leave for whatever reason. I think depopulating the area serves his purposes as well as any other. I think creating massive refugee crises in Europe, NATO countries especially, serves his purpose because it distracts the West, especially Europeans, from what he's doing. And again, I don't know how much validity you feel that has to this sort of discussion, but I do think that in some ways we get focused on nitty gritty, like how can we help Ukrainians? So that sort of gets us, deep into the granular aspect, and not so much into what we can reasonably do and what we can reasonably expect. I really believe that Putin would or will use nuclear weapons if he feels that he does not have any face-saving, for what he considers face-saving off-ramps for this. In the meantime, I've been worried for some time, and these nuclear, what's the heck's the name of it? Oh, Chernobyl was first, and now the most recent one. I think that he's possibly, because he has accused the Ukrainians of being rebels and that sort of thing. I think he would consider using dirty bombs. I really do. I think that would be a first step before he went to massive nuclear attack, whether precision or otherwise. But anyway, that's what little I have to say. There's another whole aspect of this that involves, Western right-wing movements that are working on his behalf. But I'll let you guys, comment on that and see if you think I'm completely off base. Okay, is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, and I didn't mean to make any, I seriously was not complaining about anything. I really wasn't.
No worries. Do any of our presenters want to comment on the likelihood that Putin will use nuclear missiles, on the likelihood that the method of escalation is around his ego, people like that?
Greg, go ahead.
I could just say what I think. Obviously, I'm not an expert, but I think he would use nuclear weapons as a last resort, and specifically at this point, I think he is threatening that if NATO gets militarily directly involved in Ukraine, that is a red line that he might use nuclear weapons then, and probably most likely is a tactical nuclear weapons to attack NATO troops. However, I don't think NATO is planning to do that. It would be really dangerous. But NATO is trying to supply with weapons. There are plenty of people who wants to fight. Whether it's enough or not, hard to judge. I mean, honestly, I speak to people from Ukraine. They think that they're gonna resist successfully. I mean, I personally, from my understanding, I cannot imagine how they can, even with the weapons the West can give them. Yeah, and as far as the making Ukraine neutral, to somebody else that I was reading that NATO maybe should have made Ukraine neutral. It's not up to NATO. It's Ukraine. It's an independent country. It decides whether it wants to fight or become neutral. It's their decision, and they chose to fight.
Now, I've seen several questions about what is the position of other countries outside of the West on the situation, and what is the situation of non-Westerners who are living in Ukraine. So I'll sort of discuss this a little bit. When it comes to China, China's position has generally been because they do have a historic alliance with the Russians, but they have sort of stepped back and basically said that they're not interested in the violence. They want a cessation to the violence. They haven't clarified whether or not they'll be part of the economic blockade, though. India is a very similar picture. India has historically received arms from Russia and is trying to walk a tightrope between a more Western alignment under Narendra Modi than it previously had. And so we're seeing somewhat of a shift in geopolitics there. But generally speaking, India just wants a calming of the violence. They haven't explicitly said anything that's pro-Ukrainian or pro-Russian. When it comes to the countries in the Middle East, especially Israel, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates, three of which have historically been American allies, all three of them have been reticent to criticize the Russian invasion. Again, similar to the Indians and Chinese, they have talked about a cessation to the violence, but they haven't attributed the cause to anybody. In regards to the Saudi Arabians and the Emirates, they see Russia as a more active partner in the Middle East at this point than the Americans are with the American withdrawal from Iraq, American withdrawal from Syria, and the general sort of isolationism, especially in the Trump presidency, and that Biden isn't really changing much on that front. So they don't want to upset Russia, given Russia's further entrenchment in the region. And in Israel, while there is sympathy towards Ukraine as a democratic country, there's a lot of negativity toward Ukraine because of Stepan Bandera and a lot of the pro-Banderist movements. And also there's a lot of pro-Putin sentiment in Israel that has historically derived from how they've seen him as a strong leader within Israel. Israel has a 1.2 million person Russian community, Russian Jews, obviously, but Russian community. And so there's always been a link since that point with the Russian world and Russian television. So a lot of Israelis, while they may be sympathetic with Ukraine on the democracy angle, they're sympathetic with Russia on the personal angle. And there's a number of other comments about the civilians in Russia, whether there's a pro-democracy movement, whether there is how they feel about the war. As far as I can tell, within the Russian public, and I invite our panelists to point out a little bit more clarity on this. The majority of people don't want war. Some people who don't want war may believe the war is justified, but significant percentages of the population don't even believe the war is justified and don't want war. And so we've been seeing protests in Russia to a degree we haven't seen pretty much since Putin became president.
Well, I just wanted to point one thing, and then I'll let Greg speak. So the way that Putin approached this was very methodical. First, he obviously took out parts of the Ukraine, which is Donetsk and Lugansk, and they call it, national republics of Lugansk and Donetsk. And he's claiming that Ukrainian nationalists, and he particularly says Ukrainian nationalists and fascists, are attacking the Lugansk and Donetsk area. And basically, he's saying they're killing children, they're killing, the populace, and therefore, his denazification, demilitarization is to then dismiss Ukrainian government in order to help these two republics that are within Ukraine to then basically live peacefully. And right now, believe it or not, a lot of the Russian, and by the way, they just stopped broadcasting Facebook, and no longer, if you're a Russian citizen, you can't go on Facebook anymore. So they basically trying to say that this is our news, and you just have to listen to it. And the Russian believe that there's really this atrocities going on in Lugansk and Donetsk, and therefore the Ukrainians are to blame. And they're saying, okay, well, we're gonna have to help these people. And it's absolutely not true in that regard. And therefore, he has a carte blanche to then attack the whole Ukraine. Today, he had a meeting with the pilots, women pilots and stewardesses of a Russian group. And he said one very interesting thing. He said, if Ukraine behaves the way it behaves, they will lose their government and they'll lose their independence. That was his final goal. And it was his goal from the beginning. He wanted to dismiss the government. He wanted Ukrainians to be not independent anymore. He wants to basically bring in Ukraine with Russia. They would be no longer puppet state. They would be part of the Russian Federal Republic. And that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I actually agree. That's his wish. He would love to just bring Ukraine under a Russian umbrella entirely. Whether it's possible is another question. It seems that Ukrainians are determined to stand up to that. And if he managed to cover all Ukraine, I'm sure there will be a guerrilla war, which will be actively supported by the West. And it would be impossible to hold such a big country with a huge population of 44 million. So he probably, it seems to me that he probably knows that, and he would probably roll back maybe to the eastern part, because one of the ideas is just to hold the eastern bank of River Dnieper, and maybe including the Kiev as well, and maybe leave some troops there to support a puppet government. So that's how I see it.
What about prior to 10 days ago, how popular is Putin with just the average everyday people in Russia? We don't really hear much about that just because of the
77% approval rate.
wow.
Now went all the way to 90, which is obviously doctored.
Yeah, but I think we have to ask the question, because I think we're making an assumption, and because we come from,
But
democratic society.
He's pretty popular still. He's still pretty popular. You know, there is an independent. His popularity definitely declined in the past few years because of the economic situation got worse. But he's pretty popular. I just happen to know because I spoke to some Russians who are still supporting him, and there is an independent poll by I forgot the name of that center.
Yeah.
It's hard to say, but they saying is he's like 58%. His popularity is 58% support, which probably exaggerated, but he is supported by a lot of people, probably more outside of Moscow or St. Petersburg, big cities. There are people more educated and they have more sources of information. So he is less popular in the big cities rather than the rest of the country. But I don't know. He could be supported by half of the people, or maybe 40%. Who knows?
Now, one of the questions that we're seeing from a lot of different people is there any possibility or likelihood of within Russia Putin being removed, whether it's the oligarchs turning on him because of the economic sanctions working, or if it's wide-scale protest that leads to a color revolution? Is there some sort of way within Russia that you see a serious possibility that Putin could be removed from power without in an internal Russian context?
In my opinion, not a popular movement. It's not in Russia. It's practically impossible because participation is very, very low. It's very dangerous. The only possibility is what they call palace coup. That's the only possibility. But how possible that is, what are the chances? Hard to say. But that's the only way. That's how it happened. That's how it happened to Gorbachev. That's how it happened to Khrushchev. That's traditionally a possibility that in a circle. But again, I don't know what's the possibility of that. That's the only way, in my opinion, he could be taken out.
Yeah, and one other point earlier that I know you were talking about other countries that I think is really important here is that given that the West has sort of almost gone all in. I mean, I think there's only maybe 3-4 pieces left in terms of, in essence, an economic embargo. This is a test of wills, not just for Russia. So this was a decision that we collectively made and didn't know we were, which is we went sort of all in on 22, right? We bet black, and which is to, in essence, deconstruct the Russian economy through sanctions and through basically embargoes. And the risk is, and I mean, this is a risk, is that the rest of other near authoritarian like regimes can look at this and say, well, we can't let this happen, right? Because if this becomes the status quo ante, then this is the new toolbox, right? And so I believe, and this is really this race we're on, that is his most powerful argument to those other regimes across Africa, Middle East, Southeast Asia, Asia, China, etc., Brazil, whatever, that will in essence attempt to sort of inoculate him or give him an insurance blanket to be able to pivot his economy. And I think that race is going to be very interesting because for the West to hold all these sanctions together and attempt to, convince 50 other states not to do business with Russia across, an infinite number of industries, I just don't think, that is so maximalist. It's just as crazy as his invasion to, in essence, take over Ukraine, which we have to realize what that means. It's the largest landmass country in the world, trying to take over the largest landmass country in Europe and try to do it on the cheap, right? So to try to have this kind of economic, in essence, war, and not let any other third-party state to intervene on behalf of Russia is going to be very difficult on our part, on the West. So I feel this wasn't sort of thought out on our part when it comes to, going all in on the economic sanctions to the scale that we did. And to me, the big one was the central bank. To me, I was shocked. I thought that was a real red line, actually, because you're in essence, let's just say freezing another state's assets in reserves that are held in other central banks. I think the repercussions of this are going to be massive around the world over the next decade. If you are a state that questions your place in the world order, you will not risk your reserve assets being put into, sanctionable states to any large scale. You might have it 5-10%. You won't have 60-80%. It won't be a number like that. So I think that to me is a big question mark and a race that we're in right now. To me, that's a pretty big, important thing to pay attention to.
All right. There are a number of questions. I'm just trying to sort through them. Can somebody talk about the no-fly zones and what is the possibility of them? What should they be engaged? Should they not be engaged? What are the possible ramifications of trying to create a no-fly zone in Ukraine at the moment?
So
I could only say
go ahead.
One thing that Putin, very clearly said that this is the red line.
Before, can you tell people what a no-fly zone is for people that aren't maybe familiar with that term?
Sure. A no-fly zone is when you have aircraft of one country patrolling disputed territory, and they will shoot down anything that rises up off the ground. So especially if it bears the marks of any party that is not part of the enforcer group of the no-fly zone. So in this case, it would be NATO flying their airplanes over Ukrainian territory and shooting down any Russian plane that penetrates Ukrainian airspace.
Awesome, thank you.
One other quick point to this that I think isn't really.
Oh no, let's wait, Aaron, hold on one second. Greg was
sure.
Greg was.
Oh, I'm sorry, Greg.
No. Greg, why don't you continue sharing your thoughts? Sorry, I just wanted to make sure that people understood what we were talking about. And then Aaron will go to you.
Yeah. Putin said that creating a no-fly zone in Ukraine would be a red line, and that means that he would use a nuclear weapons if that happens. So I don't think there is much of a chance of doing this. So we shouldn't even think about this because he is serious. I think he's not bluffing about that. And I'm not talking about the nuclear weapons in the ballistic nuclear weapons. I'm talking about the tactical nuclear weapons against the air defense that's providing no-fly zone.
Sorry, and on the same token, what about doing anti-aircraft batteries within Ukraine as a way of creating a no-fly zone?
Well, so quick point, and this sort of builds on what Greg was saying, is that we are in this, I would say, sliding into this escalation side where we are, there's Polish Grom M, which in the NATO terms are called SA-18s, which are the IGLA, basically man-pad systems. So think of them as like Stingers. They are being used by Ukrainians now. So we are in this strange position where we are escalating in. So if you think of the air, right? So don't think of it as you contest everything, but think of the low-lying air, basically everything up to a couple miles. The Ukrainians are basically getting a no-fly zone constructed at the low level, and NATO is sort of winking and nodding their way there, which is this is going to be an interesting test because there isn't the traditional sort of air defense consolidated radar systems when you do this. This is more opportunistic. It's sort of like RPGs in the sky, and so that's going to be one I think the Ukrainians will probably pull off, but the risk is the Russian response, right? The Russian response is just going to be fly higher and fly heavier, right? And I think the Russians have an escalation in the air, and that is to bring in Tupolev bombers, and that changes the complete equation because that's like super Grozny, where you have aerial bombing, and I think that's the risk we run into if we make it so difficult that the Russians can't use lower flying aircraft, basically their version of combat air patrols, then the Russians are just going to fly higher and fly heavier, and they're going to have less precision strikes. Not that they have extremely precision strikes right now, anyways, but it's just going to be aerial bomb. It's going to be like World War II aerial bombing, and so I think that's the thing you want to watch there. And nobody's really talking about that. It's sort of throw everything at the Ukrainians to, win the day, which I understand that, but that win the day is building a new policy. And at some point, the Russians are likely to respond to that policy. And in terms of Greg's point earlier on the tactical nukes, I still believe there's a lot of escalations, even when they went ballistic, because you can launch ballistic conventional weapons. They're actually pretty powerful. They're equivalent of about 10 cruise missiles. So, you can have a 20,000 pound, like the amount of energy generated is pretty substantial. So they could launch basically the equivalent of conventional non-nuclear ICBMs, which would be pretty devastating towards targets. And I think that would be a stage they would go through before they would go nuclear, and there would be a lot of sort of sub stages in there, which I think we would respond very quickly by turning off the air defense systems and getting away. I think that would be it.
Since there are only about 15 minutes away, 15 minutes left in the session, I sort of wanted to put out there that given the amount of interest that we're seeing, we were considering doing another series on this maybe in a few weeks time, maybe a month's time, where we would delve deeper into the history, or we could delve more into the current conflict analysis.
What are you doing tomorrow? No, I'm just kidding.
I don't know about you. I have
No, just kidding.
I have
I'm just
non-Ukrainian obligations. So if you guys are interested, Robert, could you construct a poll for us about where they would want the next session, let's say in 3 weeks to a month, to focus either on the modern conflict or the history, so that way we can prepare and provide another session where we can talk about more of these topics. I've seen, and while he's doing that, I've seen several questions about the situation of racism and migrants within Ukraine. What you're basically seeing there is sort of a Ukrainian first policy. And it's not an official policy. The Ukrainian government is trying to tell people not to be discriminatory, and the same with the Polish leadership and the Romanian and Hungarian leadership on the receiving end of these immigrants. But the people on the ground are not necessarily the most skilled, well-lettered individuals. And so what you're basically seeing is Ukrainians choosing Ukrainians over foreigners. And you have a large number of foreigners, especially in cities like Kharkiv, which is under heavy shelling right now, the second largest city in Ukraine. And the reason for that is that Kharkiv has about 20 different universities, or had. You don't know how much still survives. But because of that, you had a lot of foreign students, because tuition is about $10,000 a year, which is affordable for Africans, as opposed to the United States, where tuition is substantially more than that. So you see a lot of these people, and they're trying to get onto the trains, and they're being pushed off, and that's what you're seeing on the news, is these migrants trying to get out. Now, a secondary corollary issue is that most of these countries have a different visa policy vis-a-vis the Ukraine than do Ukrainians. Ukrainians have visa-free entry to Europe the same way that, for example, you as an American typically, right? You fly to Ukraine, you fly to Britain or France or whatever, you just show your passport, you're let in. That's the same for Ukrainian citizens going to Europe. For for non-Ukrainians living in Ukraine, like Indians, a lot of people from different African countries, they don't have that same kind of walk across the border situation. So the European Union is trying to figure out what the situation should be, and coordinating with the host countries, especially Nigeria and India, in terms of repatriating these individuals. They've been let through, but for the first few days, it was shaky as to what those negotiations would look like and how those people would need to be monitored, because they didn't have the proper visas and authorization in order to travel. So that's what you're seeing. If you're talking about some of for example, the Azov brigades, which are pro-Ukrainian neo-Nazi groups, and some of the neo-Nazi groups that are affiliated with the Russian army as paramilitaries, especially if you look at Donetsk, Lugansk, those are organizations that have been catalyzed because they have additional arms and armament, and don't necessarily reflect the official policies of the governments that are permitting them action.
So there was a good question about, okay, this sounds so terrible, and what can we do, and should we give it to Putin? Obviously, I don't think most people believe that. I have an opinion, which is, given how fast in the modern world things escalate, I think we should look at people who Putin would sit down with. And I think one of those is former Chancellor Merkel. I think another person, and this might be controversial for some people, but if you sort of can strip that away and look at sort of her background as a specialist in Russian and fluent Russian speaker like Merkel, is actually former Secretary of State Condi Rice. And so if you had a Rice Merkel sort of, shuttle diplomacy team that, can in essence speak in fluent Russian, because Merkel is a fluent Russian speaker and speaks to Putin in Russia and she's met him over 100 times and had over 1,000 conversations. Yeah, obviously. And Putin also speaks German. And so you can get to this, you can have this parallel track that, let's just call it sort of the adult track at this point. And then, that happens sort of in the back channel, kind of Cuban Missile Crisis mode, to prevent sort of a Cuban Missile Crisis. And then I think the goal has to be to get to some, either ceasefire or cessation of hostilities, or what's called conflict termination, or at least a pathway there. And I think, to me, that's sort of the thing that could go on. And the reason that's important to establish is that can be this, think of it as this sort of collection point on all sides for escalation. Meaning the day the UK wants to do X, whatever, we're gonna eminent domain 5,000 Russian properties on Monday. It's like timeout. That goes through that process, not because that's not the right thing to do at a moral level and so on, is that if we're down a path, or we're attempting to get down a path where we're trying to bring down the hostilities and the escalation cycle, we don't want a whole bunch of rogue actors that are triggering disruption to that process, which right now we don't have this. Like, this doesn't exist right now. The UN is not a party to this right now. I don't think they will be. They'll have roughly the same response that they had as they had during COVID. I mean, they'll just be a byproduct of what was going on. And you don't have it with the EU, and you clearly don't have it with NATO. And so there's no parties right now. So people are just escalating. And I think there has to be some set of parties that, whatever your politics are, I mean, no offense, I don't really care, because I value the expertise and the ability in the specialization or the relationships. And to me, that's sort of what counts right now.
Well, for the next presentation, we definitely will have more of an aspect. What I wanted to do is maybe, with Robert permission, and, just to talk about the programs that we offer within our group, and then we can continue discussion, if that's okay, Robert?
I mean, I think that this should sort of, I think we only have about 5 minutes left. So let's give our sort of piece where we talk about what we do and how you can support us if you enjoy what we're doing, if you like hearing from us. So go ahead, Zach.
Sure. So, just heard from Richard. Richard is, and Aaron.
Zach, keep in mind, a lot of people will be watching this after it's live on YouTube. So if you're talking about stuff, make sure you talk about like just overall kind of what you do, as opposed to what's happening, like say just next Thursday, if you don't mind.
Okay. So our group is basically we're involved in doing now everything. So we used to do ancient history. Now we do medieval history, and we're doing the modern, more contemporary history, as you can see in today's discussion. So please do join. We'll put in a link. The history, most ancient. We do have a website. It's called omnicarta.org, which is, you get access to our Facebook, Twitter, YouTube channel. We have over 220 videos there. And I hope you liked what we have, and most of our discussions are just like that, with people talking to each other and giving an opinion. But we do have a concrete presentation like today. Thanks, Richard was an MC, and not to dive into a lot of the details, but like I said, when we talk about Roman Empire, Greek Empire, medieval times, Crusades, we talk about Soviet times, German World War II and stuff like that, and First World War, and now Ukrainian conflict. So do join our group, and if you do join our YouTube channel, please comment, and then we also, we do accept, support, whatever you can give. I will send money today also to a friend of mine who lives in Kiev and is and bunkers many friends in his house in the basement because they're being bombed. So I'm gonna send him about $100 today, whatever I can, and I try to help him out as well. And then we will try to donate money today to if Aaron will post the link as well.
Yeah, I did. I posted it already.
I know, but post it again because people aren't going to scroll up to like an hour ago in the chat.
Okay.
And we'll post our group fund me group and a PayPal. So if you give me 50 cents, $1, whatever, some of it is going to go to cover the cost of the group, and some of it will go for donation. And and I will also send it to Robert. Wherever I donate, I'll send him the receipt or whatever.
And if you like the kind of people we are, or you like the kind of programming we do, then there's all kinds of stuff. I think, for example, I've been doing a Middle Eastern history series. That series on Thursday, and it's every Thursday, will have its 29th episode. And we have history of the Roman Empire. We have all kinds of discussions. And I also, so I encourage you to look out for our other things, many of which are co-hosted with Robert Kellerman's New York Culture Group. So if you're a member of that group, you'll see all those events showing up. we'd love to have you if you're interested in those things. And I wanted to apologize if you asked a question and I didn't get to answer it. I don't know if you can see everything in the chat or in the Q&A, but we got dozens of questions. Probably
Hundreds.
okay, there we go.
Hundreds. Hundreds of questions and comments.
Yeah, so I tried to find the ones that were the most commonly asked or the ones that seemed the easiest to answer. So I just wanted to leave on one final question that sort of caught my attention, which is, if Moscow seems so close at least achieving, under Aaron's delineation, goal 1, if not goals 2 and 3, what are we really doing in Ukraine? Is this really just a waste of money and time that the Ukrainians will eventually fail, or can this actually have some sort of meaningful outcome? And you have about 60 seconds to answer. Any of the panelists want to comment on that?
Okay, I personally think that I don't know at which line he will be able to stop. It seems to be that unlikely he would be able to hold on to the whole Ukraine. But this is the long-term struggle at this point, because Ukrainians were really a brother nation, and now they're enemies right in the border with Russia. They will never forgive this. It's a horrifying event when brothers kill brother. And I think they will not be able to suppress the whole Ukraine entirely. It's going to last for many, many years, this conflict, my opinion.
Yeah, Aaron?
So one of the reasons I think it's very important to try to get this thing de-escalated is that this runs a really high risk. I completely agree with everything that Greg said. This runs an extremely high risk of turning into a permanent insurgency. And so even when you establish ceasefires, conflict termination, et cetera, right now, because we aren't seeing, it's a black box, we see, sort of freedom fighter Zelensky, and assuming a unity of command, everybody is sort of marching in the same path. We don't know what those fissures are, and we don't know when a leader has to make deals, how those fissures, in essence, fragment and open up, and so they could lose authority over, especially more of those tip of the spear forces that the Ukrainians have, and that becomes, the FARC basically, but at a Ukrainian scale with, basically a Russian and European arms depot built on top of it. So I think that's an extremely high risk event. And I think we have a short window in this, I think 30 to 90 days.
Wow.
I always like my uplifting macro assessments. Talk to my kids, right?
What about Patty's assessment? Patty?
Yeah, the one
Hello?
voice to close out tonight. The night. Patty, do you want to give a final assessment?
No, I guess not.
All right.
So I
Okay,
personally,
that's fine. Let's just keep
Hold
going.
on. Okay,
Yeah.
sorry, I couldn't unmute. No, and I apologize if I caused any confusion, gentlemen. No, I think that you're right, Aaron. I think we have or less than 30 to 90 days. And I apologize if I missed it because I was distracted. I'm not sure, other than I heard what you said about Angela Merkel and Connie Rice. I don't see Putin in his present condition agreeing to speak to a couple of just women. I wondered if you had any additional suggestions of people who might actually effectively be able to communicate with Putin, because communication does not seem to be something that he's really big on, especially nowadays. I mean, all these pictures of, and supposedly all these processes that people have to go through just to get near enough to sit, 10 feet away at a table with him. And I really don't see him as having any particular respect for many people at all, never mind prominent women. Somebody made the point in the chat that he'd made a point of bringing his dog to a meeting with Angela Merkel because he knew she was afraid of dogs. So I'm just curious if you have, I understand what you're saying about escalation, and escalation does feel frightening, but based on past world history, I think we've found what we have learned or have seen what happens when you don't take effective action against someone who is determined to impose his will on the world. So I'm curious as to what other constructive things we might do besides that. I understand what you're saying about the economics being an escalation, but what other types of escalation are there that don't risk, that promise effectiveness, but don't risk retaliation? That would be my issue.
Patty, I'll respond to that. In my opinion, the White House, regardless of who's in the White House, whether it's Republican, Democrat, they don't like to use outside people. And I think the Condi Rice Markle thing would be a great idea. But if you look through history, if you're in the White House and you're sending outside people, then that just is telling the world that you don't have the capabilities inside your house to take care of the problem. So I would think that whoever the president is, they would say, well, no, we don't need Condi Rice. We need whoever our Secretary of State is to go over there, or whoever our, this person or that person. So if you look through history, there hasn't really been a lot of instances where the White House has sent some kind of independent person to go negotiate. Yeah, maybe for like a hostage, one person being released, like the Bill Richardson's a good example, but they don't typically send people that aren't on the formal team to these places. It's a good idea and it's worth a try, particularly if things escalate. But I just don't really see that happening, just in my opinion, because there's not really many examples through history where any administration throughout history has done anything like that.
I agree with you, Robert, and that's my frustration. Really, is like, yes, it's important to think of all the possible solutions, but that seems like a non-starter to me for both the reasons I mentioned and the reasons you're saying. Yeah. It has been done by the White House, but in the past, in the fairly distant past by now, but I agree, it's not something that would work right now. So I am curious about, I would like us to explore other possibilities because I haven't really heard much of what might be tried. And my sense is that people are, well, one of the things that really bothers me is objectifying the Ukrainian people as heroic. Yes, they are heroic, but when you objectify, you tend to do it to distract your attention from the real issues that are going on and from the real dangers that are going on. So it's just as a human trait, it's something that worries me, and it usually keeps people from thinking clearly. Putin being a perfect example of what objectification will do. But yeah, those are my concerns. I would like a group like this.
No. Hey, Patty, we have to wrap things up because we have another program. No, it's okay. But why don't we do this? How about everyone, Patty, including yourself, Zach, Richard, Aaron, and Greg? What about final closing thoughts in 30 seconds or less? Anything you want to add, or maybe any prediction on how you think this will play out? But 30 seconds or less, because we got to wrap things up.
I'll cede mine to the panelists because this is not my area of expertise.
All right, I just want to say one thing that may be pretty controversial. In my assessment of Putin in Russian culture environment, he doesn't respect women. Okay, that's my personal opinion. So I don't think, unfortunately, that even Angela Merkel or Condi Rice, it could be a good option anyway. That's just my.
Okay. What about any other closing thoughts just on the topic in general?
I agree, Greg, and I would like to see a session like this where we talked about what was possible and whether any of it, what kind of chance it might have to work. That's the thing that frustrates me. I don't think that we're really disciplining ourselves to think about that. Not that I'm saying there is one. I just think it's necessary to be focused. So yeah, for whatever that's worth, thank you.
Okay, Greg, any other thoughts just on the topic in general, not just the diplomacy thing?
Unfortunately, I can't think of what's the best way to go with this.
Okay,
Yeah.
no, that's fine.
So
What about Aaron or Zach?
Yeah.
Any final thoughts
Yeah,
before we
my thought,
wrap it up?
very quickly, I think Putin is going to get his wish. He's going to take over Ukraine. He's going to dismiss the government. He's going to merge it with Soviet, well, as one of the republics. I was about to say Soviet Republic, and virtually with something that Aaron said. Basically, a lot of the Europeans, they would rather have heat in their houses than care about Ukraine, and they'll sell them to Putin, and that's what's going to happen.
Okay, awesome. And Aaron, we'll
So-
close with you. Any final thoughts from you on the topic?
No, appreciate it. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to realize that Russia wants to negotiate with the United States to completely restructure the European security architecture. That's what this whole thing as a much larger macro. One of the reasons I recommend having Merkel and someone like Rice is that given Merkel's position in Europe, she can have that appropriate seat at the table to defend European interests. And obviously Rice is a Russian specialist and obviously somebody who could, be a functioning adult, can work with the Biden administration. And so independent of that, then the best other option is turning this into a frozen war where you just have to try to manage it and mitigate it. And I think that's really the phase that we're going to be in a matter of weeks to have to make these decisions. I don't see the political environment, both in Europe and the United States and Ukraine, positioned to make these decisions. And that to me is the risk in essence.
Okay, awesome. Well, thanks to our expert panel for sharing their insights with us. And thanks to all of you, our audience members, for watching our program today. If you missed it earlier, I mentioned that this program will be loaded on our YouTube page. It probably, though, unfortunately, will not be loaded until Monday. I'll send out an email with the link, along with some of the other links that we discuss as far as other programs we have coming up. And with that, I want to thank everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of your weekend. Let's stay safe and pray for peace, and we'll see how things develop. And we'll look forward to round two, whenever round two will be on this topic.
Thank you, Robert, Richard, everybody. Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you,
you.
panelists.
All the best.
And thank you for everybody joining us. All right.
Yep. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.